for the last episode of the GSSI webinar series of 2020. I guess that we couldn't conclude our webinars in a better way than by hosting Professor Richard Shearmur. Richard is an economic geographer. He is currently director and teach at the McGill Schools of Urban Planning in Montreal, where he also teach planning and real estate. And last but not least, also member of the l'Ordre des Urbanistes du Québec in Canada, of course. Just some notes. Our path crossed in 2012 when I was working in Paris and I applied for a Marie Curie fellowship at l'Institut National de Recherche Scientifique dans l'unité Urbanisation, Culture et Société of Montreal. Richard was working there in that period, and the research proposal focused on the interaction between different knowledge source and the urban form, which is one of the several research interests of Richard. Actually, his countless publications show that its core research interest regards basically the interaction between economic activities and innovation and space. So Richard has investigated this kind of relationship according to several dimensions. And for instance, he focused on cities and firm level innovation, but also, and this is very important to me because it's also one of my research activities on institutional innovation, namely how innovation is provided by town and cities, and so providing a sort of public good with no market, notwithstanding its importance. But currently, Richard is investigating the geography of work. So namely, the places where people actually work, which is very important in times of COVID pandemic and smart working. So with Richard today, we will try to understand which could be the future geography of the work in our world. Before leaving the floor to Richard, let me remind you that the webinar is recorded. So if you have privacy issues, please move to our YouTube channel where Professor Alessandro Crociata collects questions. Richard, I remember you that you have almost 1 hour for your speech, more or less, and that a question time will follow. So the presentation of Richard is entitled "The Changing Location of Economic Activity: How Not to Conduct Research When Everything is in Upheaval." So Richard, the floor is yours, and I'm very delighted you are here with us today. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you very much, Fabiano, and thank you for having me for this seminar. So hello, everyone, and thanks for being here, because I know it's just a couple of days before Christmas. I also know that we all have our various sort of preoccupations. Here in Canada, we're virtually in lockdown. Well, in Quebec, I should say, we're virtually in lockdown, but fortunately we have Zoom, so I can carry on my presentation. So today I'll be talking to you about the changing location of economic activity, and I'll be talking about sort of 3 different things. One is why I'm even asking this question. You know, what's this research about? And so I'll go over some of the previous research and where the idea came from to begin looking more closely at the location of economic activity, because for many geographers, it's very simple. You know, economic activity occurs in establishments, it occurs where people work. So what's the problem? So I'll describe what the problem is or was. The second story I'll be telling, because this is a bit of a story that I'm telling, is how actually research this research took place since March 2020, because I actually have a paper has just come out in Urban Studies where I present these results. But in order to present the results, I actually have to present the story. If you go to the paper, you will see that the issues I describe here are described in the Urban Studies paper. So this is not just an anecdote. These are important parts of the research which had an impact on the way it's presented and on the results. So how do you launch an original survey on job location when job locations are changing? And how do you manage all of that in a state of upheaval? And of course, the third part, although I will probably spend less time on that than on the other parts, is, well, the results. So where do people work? One of the reasons I will be spending less time on that is that basically I have presented, I wrote the Urban Studies paper which present the descriptive statistics. I haven't yet been able to analyze the data in great depth, and I'll go into that as well. So this is really what the talk is about. So I'll start off by describing all this started off with a vague idea, and I think it's useful, particularly for people who are PhD students, to sort of see where ideas come from. So I'm going to go up to the research that was occurring before I had the idea to do this research. So before I had my vague idea, many people, and including myself, we mapped job location. If we're economic geographers and we wanted to know where economic activity took place, it was very simple. We just mapped job location. So here's one example by Duncan Alexander Smith, but there are many, many others, and including, I'll go on to some of my own papers. So in this map, you see there's a polycentric city. There are different job densities. So we measure where the jobs are, and we show, well, this is where there's a lot of economic activity, and this is where there is little economic activity. And from that sort of research, we then begin to think about the structure of cities. And one example here is polycentric cities. We identify polycentric structures, but how do we do it? We use employment data. And what employment data do we use? We use employment at the place of the establishment. So these are business registers, or we use census data where people give us their address of work. And this is very classic, very standard. All the work that you see on polycentric cities, including my own, is based on this sort of approach. Commuting analysis is based on the idea that you live in one place and work in another. And so you still have this idea of economic activity occurring in one place, maybe two if you work at home, but that's it. Now, I've presented Duncan Smith's work, but my own was similar. This is a map of where business services locate. But how did we determine where business services locate in the Paris region? It's by taking employment data. And the employment, each job was located at the site of the establishment. Now, this sort of approach, my entry point has been the study of metropolitan areas, but in fact, as Fabiano mentioned, I do a lot of work on innovation. But when we try to locate innovation, we actually do the same thing. How do we locate innovation? Well, we, like in this recent paper by Morrison, Riccoboni, Pomoli, you take the location, in this case, of patent inventors, and you locate the patent inventor. The patent inventor is located often at their place of residence, sometimes at their place of work, but they are given one location based on an administrative address, and that's where we locate the knowledge or the person holding the knowledge. So all this is very standard in different areas of economic geography. Again, I'm using other people's examples, but I need to be honest, I'll use my own example. I've done a lot of work mapping innovation. And how do you map innovation? Well, you find the establishment, the address of the establishment, which has introduced the innovation or which has introduced a patent. I tend to use sort of the community survey data, and you map the innovation. And this is how the probability of innovation changes depending on the location of the establishment. But the fundamental idea which underlines this approach is that innovation is located where the establishment is located. So all of these approaches in economic geography, whether it's trying to map out the city, trying to identify polycentric areas, trying to understand where innovation happens, are fundamentally dependent on the idea that economic activity can be located. Now, that seems obvious. All location theory is about locating economic activity. You can go back at least to the Chicago School or to Weber, sort of Weberian geography, and we locate economic activity. And there's various ways of locating it. We locate where the employees work. So we ask employees for the address of where they go to work every day. We try and map inventors. And sometimes we map establishments, which are the buildings and offices within which economic activity occurs. This is very standard and has been the approach in economic geography for 100 years. And this is a building block. This is the building block from which we then identify clusters, we identify downtowns, we identify corridors of economic activity. So this is a basic building block, which we have, in a way, as geographers, surprisingly, almost forgotten. It's so basic that we don't think about it. And this was when I started my research. I started in the mid-90s. This was the basic assumption that I didn't question. However, I've been becoming increasingly uncomfortable with that idea. So back in 2006, so this is a long time ago, Bill Coffey and myself, we wrote a chapter in which we talked about a new generation of mobile workers, those who work from a combination of locations, including home, cars, trains, planes, customers' premises, and the central office of the company. Now, we mentioned them, but then we said, oh, we can't measure them. So we then used employment location data. So we were aware of the issue, but basically we couldn't measure it. So we just said, well, we'll just use the normal establishment or census data. Dish, a couple of years before, was also making a similar point. He's a transport geographer, and he mentioned a growing number of economic activities that are no longer linked to fixed geographic locations. Now, in both of these quotations, the contention is that there is a new generation of mobile workers. That may be the case. What would be really interesting is to see, well, was employment fixed to specific places before geographers became aware of it? Because there are many mobile jobs actually before the early 2000s. What happened in the early 2000s is that under the impetus of mobile phones, of the internet, people became a lot more aware. Why? Well, probably because the researchers themselves were finding that they were working from different places. And unfortunately, in research, although we try to be objective, it's often our own circumstances that determine what we look for. So when we, as researchers, began to move around, we said, oh, we better study people moving around. I'm being a bit cynical here, but I think that this is very important to realize that we actually don't know how mobile jobs were before the early 2000s. Why? Because it simply wasn't studied very much. Now, so within geography, in the mid 2000s, there were a few people who were beginning to say, hang on, economic activity is not really anchored to space in the way that we think it is, but we can't really do much about it. In sociology, on the other hand, there was a far bigger movement. John Ury, this is a 2007 book, but he wrote another book on mobilities in the late 90s. I couldn't find a picture of it quickly. And Zygmunt Bauman was writing about liquid mobility. These two sociologists were talking about how social activity in the world was less rooted, not just to space, but less rooted to family structures, less rooted to specific organizations. The Chapello book, I can't remember, a Boltanski and Chapello book, the New Spirit of Capitalism, written in the late 1990s, was also talk about how employment was moving towards gig work, and how teams composed and recomposed. People weren't working for the same company for life, or that they were just being employed temporarily for their skills and then let go. This was not geographic. So there was, whether it's John Ury or whether it's Zygmunt Bauman, they certainly mention geography, but that's not the core of their argument. The core of their argument is that social organization was less stuck within structures. Individuals were far more mobile across structures, across companies, and indeed across space. But these weren't geographers. Then, at about a few years later, but closely inspired by the sociology of mobility, there was work in management and organization studies. And in particular, Alan Felsted, Nick Jewson, I can think of, there's a number of others like Laskin in Belgium, were beginning to see that within organizations, workers were no longer necessarily sitting behind their desks every day. Now, whether they were before or not, I'm not sure, but certainly things were changing. And you can see this book from 2005 is very clearly linking the changing places of work with computerization and with mobile telephones. So this is not geography. These are not geographers. From their perspective, the issue was, well, how do you manage people who are no longer in the office? This was a management question. How do you get teams to function if people are not around? And there was a strong current of this was also about reorganizing the workplace. So this work was happening in the mid-2000s, but as you know, at about this period, or maybe a little bit later, but certainly from about 2010, there began to be the idea of hot desking, the idea of flexible workspaces. And this was brought in to manage real estate, to manage companies. It was not geographical. So geographers, despite what was happening in sociology, despite what was happening in organization management studies, and despite the fact that some geographers had some idea that something was happening, they carried on locating economic activity as if nothing had happened. So here is an extract, and I'm not trying to pick on anybody, but these are just some examples of research coming out currently in 2020. There is still a very strong current of work identifying employment of urbanization by locating jobs and by identifying where economic activity happens by locating jobs. That's the figure on the left. On the right, in innovation studies, we are still trying to locate knowledge. And how do we locate knowledge? Well, we take the location of patent holders and we say, well, that's where knowledge is located. Or where the inventors associated with the patent are, I should say. So there's still this idea that we can pin economic activity and even knowledge to specific areas in space. And in a way, this is what began to worry me. So my own work was very much based on these ideas, but I've done a lot of work on suburbanization, on polycentricity in metropolitan areas. And basically the last paper I wrote on that was in about 2007. I did a few more, but they were more derivative than anything else. And one of the reasons is I just didn't believe that the way that I was measuring employment was the right way to go about it. But this was going on in my head, and I'd moved on to studying innovation. So I'd left metropolitan areas behind. But then as I worked on innovation, the same question began to occur. You know, how do we actually locate innovation? Because it's all very well saying innovation happens in an establishment, but the people in the establishment are moving around all the time. So why do we associate innovation or knowledge with a particular address when actually the people are not always at that address? In fact, very often they're not. So I began thinking this through, and as one does when one thinks ideas through, that you start off with a sort of a vague idea. And in 2014, I was invited down to Mexico to give a talk on metropolitan areas. And the idea was I should present my work on polycentricity. But I had sort of was not terribly convinced by my own work. Not that this work is, it does tell us something about cities. It tells us where the offices are, where the factories are, but it doesn't really tell us where economic activity occurs. So in 2014, and I'm saying it's a bit late in the day because remember, already in 2006, Bill Coffey and I were sort of aware that there was something that really wasn't going right, but I was doing other things in the meantime. Finally, I started to put some of these ideas into a more structured form, and I presented this at the El Colegio de Mexico in Mexico City back in 2014. Now, I won't go over the details of the presentation, but basically I presented this figure of the city. So we no longer now have a city of nodes where you have the CBD and employment poles. You have a city where there is a transport network, which are the black lines, and we have people moving around. We have economic activity takes place along trajectories. So during the day, people are moving through employment poles, and these employment poles are still important because they have centrality. The transport networks focus on these particular nodes. These are places where there are cafes, meeting places. So if you want to meet somebody, you will tend to meet somebody at a central place where you can sit down to meet them. So there is a geography to this. This is not a chaotic city, but it's a city where people are not sitting still all day at one place. And if people are not sitting still all day at one place, then the question is, well, where does economic activity occur? Because we've always assumed that economic activity takes place where people are sitting. But if people are moving, where is it taking place? And this is really the idea that I presented in 2014. So now there's a timeline to sort of show you how the idea developed. So there was all the work that I'd done since the late 90s based on the assumption that economic activity took place where people sat. I became uncomfortable with the idea. And then in 2014, I finally did something about it. But I didn't do much. I did a presentation. And I did the presentation, and then what? I had a nice idea. That's great. But what do you do with an idea? Well, you begin to think, well, I've got this idea. Well, how can you actually conceptualize it? It's all very well showing a city with arrows like that. That's a sort of conceptual diagram. But if you really want to take it a step further and start analyzing it, you have to do a bit better than that. And obviously, if one finds a concept, then the next question, well, how can one measure it? For the time being, in 2014, I just had a sort of a vague light bulb, but I hadn't really got the concepts and I hadn't really got the measures. But I was beginning to be concerned by that. So I got a small grant in 2016, and I hadn't really moved very far with that. But then I had a PhD student came along, Filipa Pajovic, who's actually just graduated. Excuse me. And we began having discussions because she came along and she was interested in where, in sort of mobile economic activity. And she was determined to do a quantitative PhD where we would use information from mobile telephones to determine where people worked. But I was saying, well, we can't do that. And she said, well, why can't we do that? Well, so, well, first of all, it's difficult to get the data, but also we're not quite sure what we are measuring. And we had big debates, and we talked about this for about 18 months. And then these debates had got us so far that we said, all right, we've actually got to put this down on paper to sort out our ideas. And so we wrote this paper called Catch Me If You Can, and that's Filipa's idea. It's a great title. And these are a couple of extracts from the conclusion of the paper. So it became evident, so during our discussions, that we currently have insufficient knowledge about workplace mobility to devise sensible indicators or to interpret the data. So basically, we didn't know what we were looking at. So it's all very well to want to conceptualize and measure something, but actually, we didn't really know what we were trying to conceptualize. We didn't have the basic information. And in the paper, we outlined the reasons why big data are not yet appropriate for this type of research. Why weren't they appropriate? Because big data, you always make inferences from big data. You don't measure things directly. Big data are just a projection, a vague projection of the world, and you have to interpret them. But if you don't have a detailed understanding of what you're trying to extract from big data, then big data are just people moving around. And basically, we couldn't use big data because we don't know what people are doing in the places where we identify them. And so we then moved on, say it's only by performing more qualitative on-site observational and ethnographic studies that one can begin to understand how individuals separate work from other activities and where these different types of activity can take place in space and along trajectories. So we moved away from a quantitative approach and concluded that to really understand workplace location, we actually had to go back to the drawing board. We couldn't just use data out there because we didn't know what we were looking at. We had to go and do our detailed studies of where people actually work. So we got to that that conclusion. That's one part of where we were in about 2016, 2017. The other part, and this is a chapter that I was writing at the same time, it just through the accidents of publication came out a year later, where I was thinking through, well, if we are thinking about where people work, basically not all jobs are the same. Down the left side of this table, you see 3 types of job. Now, of course, there may be 4 or 5, but there were 3 types of job were identified. There were the hypermobile jobs. Those are the jobs that can be performed in a wide variety of locations, where, okay, you meet from time to time in places, but basically all you need is an internet connection and a computer. Then you have the semi-mobile jobs. So these are jobs where people move around, but they're very linked to specific places or to specific capital. Now, this would be typically in transport, where you are driving a vehicle. So you are stuck to that vehicle, you are stuck to a network. And so there's a very material aspect, and you need a lot more than just your Wi-Fi and your computer, and you can't really work anywhere. And then you have jobs which really can't move at all. And those are jobs performed mostly in specific locations. So a lot of retail, if you were a lot of personal service work, but also surgeons that, for example, they need to go and work in a hospital. So this brings us on to the second dimension, because in the sociology literature, there was a hint in the mid-2000s that mobility was linked to power. The more power you had, the more mobile you could be. And this really, and to be fair, people like John Ury were backing away from that at the time that I was writing. But still, there was this idea that mobility and power went together. This is something that we didn't agree with at all, and so I divided this column into this table into 2 columns. You have hypermobile jobs of people with little workplace power. So you can be a young contractual consultant, doing your gig work, a postdoctoral student. There's maybe some of you out there right now. You can be a sales representative. These are jobs that don't have a huge amount of power, but you are still hypermobile. On the other hand, you can be a bank manager or banker, a tenured university professor, an established consultant, where you have the power and the mobility. And the same is true for semi-mobile jobs. You can have sort of rather powerful and good jobs like airline pilot, ship captain, or you can be a truck driver or construction worker. So you have the more powerful and the less powerful jobs within this semi-mobile category. And then the same for immobile jobs. The fast food, janitor, factory workers don't have much workplace power, whereas the surgeon, luxury hotel manager, air traffic controllers have more power. Now, we'll come back to this table later, because really, when we look at what happened during COVID, it's the hypermobile jobs which are those which are able to work from home. But the semi-mobile and the immobile jobs, nothing has changed for them. And so when we talk during COVID of a revolution of the workplace, of everybody working from home, of course, not everybody. It is just the people with hypermobile jobs who are able to work from home. But they're not the ones giving presentations or writing newspaper articles. So all the people who are writing the articles that you are reading are sitting at home. And so we think that everybody's doing like us. We tend to forget the semi-mobile and the immobile jobs. I mean, from time to time, they're mentioned on the news, these wonderful people working in hospitals. But we forget that if they're working in a hospital, they're not sitting at home. So from an economic geography perspective, when we're thinking of the future of work, remember this table. There are many jobs which are linked to capital, linked to networks, linked to specific places, and that hasn't changed during COVID. But the hypermobile people are the ones who are working from home and writing about it. Anyway, that's an aside. We'll get back to that a little bit later. So this is the state of play, or of the ideas, if you will, in about 2017, 2008, well, 2017. Publication dates are always about 18 months after we've thought of things. So two streams of research began. On the one hand, there was this need for ethnographic and qualitative data, or information, I should say. And Philippa, who had come along to do quantitative work, had been convinced that really we needed to do the ethnographic work. And a student, Lucas, who was doing his master's at the time and who's now doing a PhD, they began to go out interviewing people. So during all the time that I was thinking of measurements and thinking of how to produce a survey, I was also getting information and having discussions with my students who were really talking to people and coming back with sort of descriptions, rich descriptions of where people work. So this was happening in parallel. In 2018, I launched a very informal, non-representative web survey of work locations. It was convenient sampling, so I set the survey up on the web-based questionnaire. And what was important was not so much for it to be a representative sample as to test the ideas. So you may not be able to see too clearly the details of the survey, but it's important to see how I was trying to operationalize this idea of work happening in multiple places. So I inquired of the people who answered the survey. I said, for your 5 most recent working days, you'll be asked about the types of work activity you have performed and approximately how much time you have devoted to each activity. So in different places. And there were 7 types of place. And for each of those places, I wanted to know what type of activity the person had done there. So the first place was your regular workplace. Unless your regular workplace is one of the 6 others. So your regular workplace, which could be a factory, could be an office, and they told me what it was. So your regular workplace, at home, during normal working hours, at home, outside normal working hours. I separated the two because some people obviously work at the office during the day and at home at night. So I just didn't want to just have at home. I wanted to know if it was extra work or the core of their day. In the premises of clients, suppliers, or collaborators, in transport, including waiting rooms, in cafes, restaurants, hotel lobbies, in a co-working space. And I assume that there was also, yes, they could also add an 8th place, which was an other place. So although there is an infinity of places where people could work, I couldn't measure an infinity. So based on the qualitative work that Philippa and Lucas had done, and also based on a lot of the reading of management literature and other, I had determined that there are these 7 sorts of space are the ones that I wanted to inquire about, and I got information on them. Now, interestingly, I had come up with this measurement instrument before I had actually really conceptualized, well, how am I going to use this information when I get it? So I ran the survey in an opportunistic way. I had 3 entry points. I have a good connections with an association of Quebec municipalities, so they circulated the survey. I have good connections with a research center at McGill, so they publicized the survey. And I also rang up and contacted all my friends and saying, could you answer as well? So I had about, I think, 300 responses. I can't remember exactly, but obviously it wasn't representative of anything, but it gave me some information to work with. And then I got the information, say, what do I do with it? And this is when I began to say, okay, well, how can I conceptualize? I have all these spaces. Now, how can I actually transform this into some concepts which are useful for researchers? And this is where the idea of thinking of work location as a probability space began to emerge. And in fact, I published a paper which came out just last year called Conceptualizing and Measuring the Location of Work Location as a Probability Space. Now, this is an interesting paper because, as you will see if you have a look at it, it is based on that small survey, a small web survey, non-representative. So, you know, those of you who are out there saying, how can you possibly publish work without having 10,000 euros to do research? Well, this was done on a shoestring. I had no money. I did the web survey myself. I got some census information, and that cost me, I think, well, actually, I'd say it didn't cost me anything. It only cost me something because I wanted it formatted. So it cost me about $1,000 to get the census information. And that was it. So you can do research without a huge amount of money if you have some ideas. So I got this information, and then I said, well, how do I present it? Then I said, well, I'll present work as a probability space. What's a probability space? A probability space is a set of possible outcomes or results to which you assign a probability. Now, the simplest one is a probability space for a dice throw. A dice has 6 sides, and the probability space is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. And we know that if the dice isn't weighted, there's 1/6 of a chance that any side will turn up if you throw it. So that's a probability space of a dice. There's 6 possibilities, and we know the probability of each possibility. That's basically what a probability space is. So then I thought, well, when we look classically at work location, we are also thinking of a probability space. And this is the classic conceptualization of work location. It's a probability space where you have 2 locations, work and home. So work is W, home is H. X, Y are the geographic coordinates. So you have the geographic coordinates of work, the geographic coordinates of home, and the upper index I is for each worker. So each worker has a work location and a home location. And there's a residual. There's up in the right-hand corner, there is a residual. And this is what we find in the census data. The census measures place of work outside the home. That's one possible work location. Or you work at your home, that's the second. Or we don't know where you work, and that's the third. So there were 3 possibilities, 2 of which had XY coordinates. You'll notice there's no XY coordinates on the R because that's not a geographical, that's just we don't know. And the census and most other types of information that we use to locate economic activity functions on this basis. And we take the worker, we say they are working at an XY coordinate, and it's either at a workplace outside the home or it's at the home. So we do have information on people who say that they work most of the time at home, but there's 2 locations, and there's only one possible place that's recorded. In each person can only give one answer to this. So the probabilities are either 100% or 0. So one of these, W, H, or R, will be 100%, and each of the other 2 will be 0%. But that is actually a probability space. It's a very basic probability space because there's only probabilities can either be 100% or 0. And obviously the sum of all probabilities has to come to 100. So basically there can only be one of these 3 locations, but that is a probability space. Once you think of work location like that, then it becomes a lot easier to take this survey and to explain what you've done. What I did in that survey was I expanded the idea of the probability space. The probability space of work now has many more possible locations. So we still have WXY, a usual place of work, because many people do go to a usual place of work each day. We also have HXY, which is home, because many people work at home, and that's what we're already used to. We already find that above. But then I've added some other things. You have that line between home and work, which is transport. So some people work when they're on the metro, on the train, in a car, in a waiting room. So there is one, we don't have XY coordinates, but it is geographical. It's along a geographic network. So people can say, well, we work in transport networks. And then up at the top, there's P1, P2, PN. These are all the other places we can think of that people work. So P1 could be co-working spaces, P2 could be a cafe, PN could be in the park. And there's a percentage associated with each of those spaces. But you'll note that there's no constraint on the percentage. Here, it's not 100% or zero. The percentage can take any value provided that the sum of all percentages reaches 100. So, you know, there's only you don't have 120% probability of working. There's only there's only a probability of 1 of working in any space, but that could be subdivided across many spaces. So in practice, what I did then was ask people to estimate how long, how many hours they spend working in each of the different types of location during a week. So if you go back to this, they have 7 places plus a residual. And I asked them to tell me how many hours and minutes they spent working over the last 5 days in each of these spaces. So when we get to the probability space, each person worked 100% of their working time. So the 100% corresponds to their total work week. And I can then say, well, they spent 3% of their work week working on the train, 80% of their work week working in an office, 10% of their work week working at home, and you sum them all up, you get 100% of the work week. And that is, in fact, if you sum then, that's for each worker. And if you sum that across the whole of the population, you then can map out, because remember here, we do have the XY coordinates, which we can define in various ways. We can then map out the probability that in any one portion of the city, there is work is taking place, or economic activity happened there over the last 5 days. And so for each individual, we know the proportion of time that they spent working in each of the possible work locations. We know that that proportion has to sum to 100 for each individual worker. And then when we do the sum across the whole of the population, we can then get the probability space for the geography that we are looking at. So this is what this 2020 paper is presenting. And I use the census data to show what the results are like if we just use a census. And then I use my survey, which, yes, was not representative, but was a good tool to show how this idea could be applied. So if I go back here, oops, I had the nice idea and I had now conceptualized it. And it didn't happen in a nice linear way. I actually started the measurement, and it's as I was trying to work out, well, I've measured it, but what do I do with it? That I said, okay, well, actually, the concept is the concept for probability space. And so it doesn't happen in a linear way. It would be nice if research was linear, but it very rarely is. Okay, so I had got to that stage. But now that I'd got the concept and I'd sort of measured it, the next challenge was to say, well, how do I really measure it? How do I go out and get a representative sample of a population? Because it's all very well doing convenience sampling, but you don't know what's happening at the level of the population. Now, I was very lucky in 2019, a colleague, Priscilla Ananyan, was leading a project on co-working spaces, and she asked me to join. I said, I'd be delighted to, if we can include a representative survey of work location, following the model which I experimented in 2018. So she was interested because we wanted to position co-working spaces in the wider sort of universe of where people work. And so we began developing a survey instrument in summer 2019. And the picture is of winter because I'm sitting here staring at the snow right now. Anyway, we started developing the questionnaire, and by early 2020, the instrument is ready, finance for the survey is in place, and ethics approval is finally obtained. So I was about, after all these years, you know, I'd started mentioning it in 2006, I had conceptualized it slightly in 2014, I'd been through all these stages, and now we were about to launch the survey, which was going to sort of be a proof of concept, if you will, more than a proof of concept, it would be an actual measurement of things I'd been thinking about for 15 years. And we had a work plan. We had a great work plan. The survey was going to be delivered to the survey firm on about March the 20th. We were going to do the piloting and checks, and that would take 10 days to 2 weeks. They'd sort of do 50 questions. We'd analyze them just to make sure that the questions were being answered properly, and then we'd go ahead. The survey would be live from mid-April to mid-May. This was a telephone survey. We knew what the population was. We were going to interview all Montrealers with a job, stratified by age. Why age? Because we thought that the relationship with technology differs depending on whether you're older or younger. Economic sector and language, because there is an Anglophone and a Francophone population in Quebec. And it was going to be a random selection of all Montrealers with a job, contacted by phone, 50% landline and 50% randomly generated cell phone. So everything was great. And we were going to basically redo my 2018 survey, but on a representative sample. Right. And then COVID came. And you think, grief, why didn't COVID wait for a month? Because everything was planned and that work plan just went down the bin. And this is important because it really has an impact on the survey, but it also is about doing research during COVID. So, pardon me, our work plan was blasted out of the water, but like most people in March 2020, our first reaction was no problem. It will be over in a couple of weeks. We'll just put the survey off. We wanted to launch it in mid-April. We'll launch it early May. And so we did nothing for a couple of weeks because, hey, this was going to be a temporary thing. Then early April, okay, it lasted more than 2 weeks, but we say, well, it'll be over by May or June. So no problem. We'll put the survey off until September. Of course, we didn't want to do the survey in the middle of summer because people are on vacation. So, this was, there was no big issue. We would just wait till things got back to normal and launch the survey after 3 or 4 months in September when people were back to work. So let people go on vacation, let COVID go away, and things will get back to normal. So that was a second reaction. Of course, also during survey, our lives were in total upheaval. And this is very important. As researchers, we can present our research as if we are computers, as if basically we know what we're doing and everything was rational. But it wasn't terribly rational. I totally forgot the survey. I had my kids at home. My students were worried. I was, and still am, director of the School of Urban Planning. So I had my staff wondering what to do. I had colleagues not knowing what to do. I didn't know what to do, but I had to pretend that I knew what to do because I was a director. And so all this was sort of happening around. And so the survey was basically not really top priority. So we were, and this was me and other people on the team. So basically the survey just disappeared from our lives because we were taken up in all the turmoil. In May, when we began to realize that the survey was settling in, not the survey, that COVID was settling in, I didn't return to the survey. I was directing a school. I was taking decisions. Do we teach online or offline? What do we do for international students? How do we rearrange conferences? So basically, I and everybody else in their own areas was involved in trying to do our jobs, trying to manage students, trying to manage the university. So basically, we weren't there thinking about survey methodology and what to do with the survey. So things began to calm down. We knew that we were in for the longer haul by about mid-May, and term had finished because term finishes end of April, early May. I'd set out a plan for the school, at least for the summer, and I could finally return to the survey. So by about mid-May, I could return, or we could return, but I was mainly leading the survey, so it's mainly me who was returned to this. So we got to take a decision about the survey. So because we realized that COVID was going to be around, it was no longer a question of putting it off to September. Says, pardon me, do we just simply put it off for a year or two? You know, we get on with the other part of the research and come back to survey when COVID is over. Just as well we didn't, because we still wouldn't have done the survey had we taken that decision. Do we run it now? But we can't really run the survey now because the survey was designed over the year before COVID. So it's no longer the right survey to do during COVID. Or do we take advantage of COVID and rethink the survey? So we decided to take the third option, to take advantage of COVID and rethink the survey. Now, of course, it meant that we had to really rewrite the survey. So as opposed to the survey that I'd proposed before, which was basically asking people in detail how long they spent working in each of 7 different locations, and asking them what they did there and what they felt about it. So you get an idea of what they were working, why they were working there, in a sort of a world where things weren't changing. Suddenly the survey had to be rethought. We had to ask people, where did you work before COVID? You know, in the 7 different places. Where are you working now? And where do you think you will be working after COVID? Now, these may seem like small changes, but remember, this is a survey. A survey has to not be too long. A survey has to sort of be presented, the language, you have to sort of explain to people what you're doing. So essentially what we were doing was rewriting the survey instrument. When we add the before, during, and after COVID questions, the wording of the question changes. We had to shorten many other parts of the survey because we were tripling the number of questions we were asking about job location. And there was many questions that we asked, we had to reduce them. We're still asking people about how they felt, how they related to where they were working, and we needed to change all those questions. So all this happened between mid-May and early June. So remember that this survey instrument had been worked upon basically since 2017, because it was a similar instrument to the one that I'd used in my survey. And in 2.5 weeks, it was totally rewritten. So we did it and we launched the survey. We had to launch it quickly before the summer vacations kicked in, because COVID or not, we didn't want to launch the survey in July, but also we wanted to launch it in June and not in September, because we wanted people to accurately, or as accurately as they could, recall where they were working in detail in February or before COVID struck. So mid-June, this was, March, we were asking people to think back 2.5 months, or maybe 3 months. And also in a situation where it had been burnt into their mind because everybody knew, what they were doing just before COVID. So it was reasonable to think that people could accurately recall where they were working in mid-June. And so we published we did the survey and published the results in a recent paper that's just come out in Urban Geography again. Now, the results, so this is a table about the representativity of the sample, but there were a number of issues. First of all, how can you tell that a sample is representative when there is no good stats for local post-COVID employment? So if you have a representative sample of people working, you have to know what that population is, but COVID had just upset all of that. Another thing you'll note down here is that although we interviewed 1,700 people, we only used 1,325 respondents. Why were there so many problematic observations? So basically, there were 3 issues with this survey. First of all, we wanted to interview people, and we did interview people in the same job between February and June 2020. We didn't want people who'd moved jobs because we wanted to study job location independently of a change of job. But there are 2 problems. First of all, there are no reliable statistics for employment by sector in Montreal on a monthly basis. Normally, that's not a problem. If you want to have a representative sample in June, you can use the average figures over the last year. It's not a big issue in a stable environment to use historic data to make sure that you are properly sampling your population. But here, everything, the population had changed. The people at work had changed, so we didn't have any good data to identify our population, even to identify the structure of the population. And of course, we had no way of identifying as a population the people who had not changed jobs between February and June 2020. Again, it's not a big issue. People don't change jobs that often in normal period. So if we were doing a survey in June, we could have used the employment data for sort of January to March. But of course, all that had changed. So what population? That is a big question. How do we know that our sample is representative when we don't know what we're representing? The second issue is that we were studying a moving target. We were studying job location, but at a time when job location was changing. How do you find the correct terminology, the correct categories, the correct questions to ask when basically everything is changing? Everything was moving at once. So it's rather difficult. Normally, we don't study a moving target. It's taken years. Sorry. It's taken years to conceptualize this, and all of a sudden we had to sort of rethink things. And also, I mentioned the sort of crisis situation that we were working in. There was precipitation and mistakes. I discovered a sizable number of people who declared very long work weeks. And this is the one I want to insist on a little bit. I'll try and wrap up as soon as I can. This was a fundamental issue. 257 people declared work weeks of over 80 hours. That's just not feasible. And why did they do it? Well, after having looked at the data and thought about it, looked at the questionnaire, I think I know why this happened. The main issue is this. In the questionnaire, the probability space was conceived as non-overlapping. There were these 8 possible places of work. Remember, there's that other category here. There's 8 possible work locations. And in my mind, and as I explained it to you in the concept of probability space, these don't overlap. If you sum up the percentage of time spent in all these locations, it should sum up to 100%. But what I think happened is that in many people's minds, or in some people's minds at least, these overlap. So in other words, you can be working at home, but if you then have a co-working space close to home and you go and work 3 hours there, you will say, yes, I work 30 hours at home, and yes, I work 3 hours in a co-working space, but those 3 hours are included in your at-home time. And this is a fundamental conceptual issue, which I think led to so many people declaring very high work weeks. So, for example, somebody could declare that they worked 30 hours at home, 15 hours in an office, 10 hours in a cafe, 20 in a co-working place, 7 doing micro work, which is sort of answering your cell phone on the move, and 5 in transport. So they may declare 87 hours. Whereas in fact, their real work week was 30 hours in the office, of which 20 in a co-working space. Why? Because their office is a co-working space. 3 doing micro work because they walk around the office with their cell phone, and 3 in transport as they went to meetings. 15 hours was spent at home, of which 3 in a cafe. You just pop out and work a little bit in a cafe. 4 doing micro work. You're walking around the home or to the cafe using your cell phone, and 2 in transport, and 7 hours specifically going to a cafe to work. So their real work week may have been 52 hours, but when you sum it all up, it gives you 87 hours. And I think that is why we had so many people answering giving us very high totals. So how do you deal with these issues? It's not possible to completely deal with it. But what I did was all excessively long work weeks were deleted. And by cross-referencing questions, certain obvious duplications were corrected. For example, if somebody said they worked 40 hours in an office outside the home and 40 hours in a co-working space, and if on top of that, in another question, because I asked normal census questions, they said they worked in a co-working space, then I deduced that this 40 hours in an office was in fact 40 hours in a co-working space. And so there was a number of manipulations you could do. I didn't do many, but I managed to save a few observations like that. Basically, I deleted all the ones over 80 hours. This is a distribution of work times. So the average working week is 42 or 41 hours, which makes sense. Remember, I'm asking also people about the work they do at weekends, the work they do on transport. So I expect to have slightly longer working weeks. There's about 11%, 15% are working over 60 hours a week, so which is probably slightly high, but I'm not too worried. I don't think the overlapping is a major issue once you get rid of the major overlaps. And then we also deleted, but this was for other reasons, 118 observations where less than 3 hours work were declared. These were students doing very short work, and we decided that we didn't want to have those in the analysis. Okay, so sampling uncertainty, that's just an economic shock. We couldn't do much about it. Changing target, well, that's the reason we had to rewrite the questionnaire. The issue of overlapping probability spaces, that's just simply a mistake. The questionnaire should have been clearer, and I should have realized that a key assumption was to really get people answering the questionnaire to realize that they couldn't have overlapping answered. And it was overlooked because of the mayhem. This was a chaotic research, a chaotic rewriting of a questionnaire. And also because we had to get the survey out before summer, we didn't do proper piloting. We asked a few students to answer it quickly, but we didn't do proper piloting. We didn't have the time. And this is what happens when you make mistakes like that. So are the data useless? Well, this is actually directly out of the paper, just to show you can publish papers even when your data aren't perfect. So in the paper, I explained that 3 elements have impacted the quality of the data, making them less precise and more impressionistic than typical survey data. The rapidly evolving nature of work arrangements, the personal and empirical uncertainty under which we were all working, and the new way that work location was being broached. Respondents were not all familiar with the idea of subdividing their work activities into discrete space time components. So the data are not useless, but they are not absolutely precise. This is again from the paper. The data are less precise than desired, but they are the best possible given the circumstances. And that's important. We did the best we could under very difficult conditions to get a survey out at a critical time. There was a problem with the way that we presented the survey. We weren't clear that work times couldn't overlap, but we realized the problem and we made corrections which were sufficient to end up with a table like this, which is a reasonable distribution of work times, even though you could say it's maybe, there is still some overlap, but the overlap is not invalidating. Now, I won't have time now to go over all the results. You can read the paper, but I think it's more interesting for you to hear how the research was done than to look at the results. I'm sorry that we can't go over that, but I do need to wrap up. So other COVID related issues. Well, I mentioned that as a researcher, I'm also doing other things. I'm also director of a department. So the data are very rich and original, and I haven't yet got around to analyzing them properly. There are many now surveys of COVID work location, but there are a few that ask such a wide array of questions, and there are a few, or actually I think there are none, that approach place of work as a probability space. So I'm going to go back to these data and analyze them in more detail. Up till now, it's basically descriptive. And I'll quickly just tell you what's a few key results. In fact, the less educated people, is hardly any shift. This 1.5% is the shift away from their normal place of work. So less educated people, they've hardly shifted. People with masters and PhDs, there's a 33.6% shift in time away from their usual place of work. So they used to work 67% of their time in their usual place of work before COVID, and after it's 69%, after it's 35%. So the more educated they are, the more you shift away. The larger the establishment, the more you shift away from your usual place of work. In small establishment, there's a very small shift, and the large establishment, there's a 33% shift. This is the shift in time away from a usual place of work. And if you work in the central business district, there's a huge shift of 42%. But if your job is in the suburb, it's only a shift of 14.9%. So there are clear structures, geographic structures. Small and big companies, not the same. The more educated they are, the more you tend to work at home during COVID. And there are different results for economic sectors as well. And each is significant. I haven't mentioned gender because gender only squeaks through when you don't control for location and is not significant when you control for location. So that's a brief overview of the results. So to conclude, research does continue under COVID. And I think that the research that continues is research which picks up on what people were doing before. There are many people who have rushed in and suddenly become experts on work location. I think it's better off, people are better off sticking to what they know and then thinking through, well, how does COVID affect this? And what could it be after COVID? You can see that I was lucky to be working on something that suddenly became really key during COVID. I didn't suddenly become a specialist on work location during COVID. I've been thinking of this for the last 15 years. And it so happened, partly I was lucky, partly I wasn't. I've explained why I was both lucky and unlucky, that I was just about to launch a survey, a detailed survey, when COVID came. But in whatever research is being done, it will be the good research that emerges will be research that's a continuation of what research has been doing before. But also we have to realize that COVID has brought specific challenges, and I've described those challenges: the time, the stress, illness, lack of travel. I mean, you can't exchange, you can't present these data at conferences, you can't discuss them, and didn't have time to pilot the survey. There's a whole bunch of other things that are happening during COVID, which we all subjected to. Another thing that's emerged is that data don't need to be perfect. There is a tendency for researchers to seek perfection. And it's good as an ideal. I've got nothing against perfection as an ideal, but as a researcher, we have to be practical. Data need to be good enough. When we came to that crucial decision that we made in May to run the survey in June so that we could capture the pre and the post-COVID, that was a risky decision, but we really wanted to get the pre and the post-COVID data. We did the best we could. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it's good enough. When we then look at our conclusions and we compare them to other sort of more specific or less detailed survey, nothing that we have found in our survey contradicts what other people have found. But the advantage of our survey is the way that we've conceptualized the workplace and the richness of the data, which I haven't really been able to present to you in today. I was more focused on the process than on the results. But why was this imperfect data good enough for for publishing papers? It's because of the conceptualization and the pertinent question. So when you are developing research, it's key that your research is very well conceptualized, very well anchored in the literature, and you're asking a pertinent question. And if you have good concepts and a pertinent question, even if the data is not perfect, you will be able to actually do some good research. On the contrary, if you have perfect data, which is fantastically collected, but you don't know why you've collected it and you have no underlying concepts, your data is worthless. And that's a bit the problem with big data. The big data issue that we found was that we could have fantastic data, but we had no concepts. We couldn't analyze it without concepts. It's better to have rough data, good enough data with good concepts and a pertinent question than the opposite. It's best to have obviously perfect data and great concepts, but that's not always possible. And to conclude empirically, well, the location of office work has changed during COVID, but it was changing before. As you saw, there's a long run up to this shift to remote work, and it didn't just happen because of COVID. COVID has accelerated existing trends, but the move to work from home would not have been possible if most companies and employees were not already working part of the week outside the office. So two things which I haven't really had time to cover on the empirical side. It is only office workers and educated workers who moved their place of work. The less educated people and the people who don't work in offices, not much has changed for them in terms of work location. The fact that office workers were changing the way they worked has a long history before COVID. And COVID, it was easy to change where we worked. People in office work, the people with hypermobile jobs, it was easy to change because it was already happening before, and it just was a shift in a probability space. We already worked from home about 20% of the time, and I didn't present you that data, but most people worked at home about 20% of the time before. And yes, it's shifted now to 50 or 60% for some people. But the fact is that shift is easy to do if you're already doing it. And that's something that when people talk about the revolution in the workplace, it's not really a revolution. It's just more emphasis placed on working from home, but most of us were already doing it before. And I'll stop there. I'm 5 minutes over. I hope that's not too bad.
Thank you, Richard. It's okay. We began a couple of minutes after the hour. So thank you very much for your interesting and timely presentation, and thank you for having let us walking with you along I'm going to say along the process of design of a survey. I think this is very interesting also for our students to be in touch with all the problems and all the questions and all the discussions which are relating to the designing of a survey, which is actually a complex work to do. So thank you again, and now we will collect questions from the audience. I know there are also some students which are studying this kind of topics, and please, if you have any question, raise your hands. And also Alessandro Crociata, if there are please check if are there some questions from YouTube. Okay. So just to break the ice, I have an observation, a question, Richard, which is related to the last sentences you showed us in your slide. So basically, we saw that there are two kinds of patterns, so between less and more educated people. So maybe I can say, at least in Europe, but also in Canada, I guess we were yet witnessing a sort of polarization process, which regards wages, for instance, but also I can say a territorial polarization of the economic, socioeconomic potential. So, in my opinion, this kind of asymmetry between less educated and more educated people could be the source, could trigger more inequalities and asymmetries between citizens. Actually, I imagine that people which are less educated, they must, however, commute to their work, and so there is a cost which is related to the commuting itself, but there is also a cost opportunity in terms of yes, in terms of other action you can do during that time. So, is this another way our society are polarizing wealth, well-being, and so on, in your opinion?
Absolutely. In fact, I go over that in the paper as well, because I also did some report in the paper some of the more qualitative results as well. So the survey results and some more qualitative results. And what emerges from that is, from the data, as I showed you, it's really the people with lower education and the tradespeople. They are still working outside the home most of the time. I mean, there's virtually no shift to home. And the more educated you get with it, you know, there's a bigger shift from home, which means that it's the people on the lower end of the education, and education is a proxy for sort of social status. So it's people with the lower social status are more exposed to the virus, are also being paid less. And this is something that we are that journalists have made us aware of, but it really comes out of the data. And I think that there's something else that we need to realize, that even, and this comes out of the interviews, people working from home, it's not comfortable for many people working from home. There was a lot of people, and it's not just childcare. Childcare, you can say, well, that's due to COVID. When children are back at school, it will be fine. But many people, young people, are sharing flats. many people, I mean, in Canada, we have lots of immigrant families, and they're often living in small rental apartments, you know, with a number of family members, certainly for the first few years of their life in Canada. There are people who are living in very bad relationships. And all these people, when they're trying to work from home, they can't. Or it's very difficult. So one concern about this shift towards working at home, if offices begin to assume that people will work from home, and if you no longer can work outside the home, what you were doing is you were saying you can only people who already have a nice house and a home office can actually have a job. And so these are the better jobs. They're going to be reserved for people who have good housing. And so I think this is a very pernicious cycle that we have to be very careful of, that working from home has been presented. And this is why I'm not just making a joke when I say the people writing from home are often well-off people who are enjoying it and have the time to write. And for them, it's great. They're not commuting, they're in the countryside. But the people who are really struggling are not the ones writing the papers. And I think that many of the younger people who, you know, we know that even before COVID, it was difficult for people to leave home to find an apartment because real estate is very expensive. They're often working gig jobs, so they can pay rent 1 month and not the next. So they're often, you know, relying on their parents or living in with friends. For these people, working at home is really very difficult. For noise issues, for space issues, for confidentiality issues. And we are not really thinking enough about them, I think.
Okay, thank you, Richard. Are there any questions from the audience? Our students? No questions? So I have another one. I exploit your presence here. So I would like to know your opinion, Richard, about about the inner areas. And you know, in Italy, for instance, someone is claiming that with pertinent policies related to the smart working, for instance, we could have some positive feedbacks in terms of residentiality within inner areas. So of course it depends also of course of the work we are focusing on, because as you told us, part of work cannot be teleworked. But could you think that such policies could indeed mitigate the increasing divide between urban and inner area? I don't really know what is the situation in Canada. You know, in Italy, we have almost 8 million persons living in within our inner areas, which represent more or less half of our municipalities. So it's a huge part of our territory and an important part of our citizens living there. So I don't know, given the fact that, of course, there are some important difference between, for instance, density of population in Canada and in Italy, but which is, in your opinion, I can say your opinion about this kind of request in terms of smart working?
Well, I think that the situation in Canada is indeed very different, because the geography of our cities is different. Typically in the large Canadian or North American cities, you have the geographically central areas are the ones with offices and with big institutions. And over the last 20 years, there's been a rapid growth of people living there. But these are wealthy people, the professional people. The less well-off people, and this has been happening over the last 30 or 40 years, are now in suburban areas, not in distant suburbs. They're in suburbs, in the old 1950s suburbs. So if you, in Montreal or Toronto, real estate in the center is, before COVID, used to be very expensive. The inner suburbs, 3 to 7 kilometers, tend to be, there are some pockets of great poverty and other more wealthy. And then when you move further out, where basically you cannot survive without a car, then you begin to have better off suburbs. So the poverty is in a ring now around the center and not in the center. So in terms of the impact of COVID on centrality in Canadian cities, the question is, well, if with very few people commuting in, and with the possibility of everybody working from home, and I say it's a possibility, I don't think it will happen, then are the downtowns going to become empty? And if they become empty, then actually they will become places of residence for poor people. I mean, those of you who read about San Francisco know that one of the big issues there is that fewer people are working in downtown, and a lot of homeless people, lots of people with mental health issues are going to downtown. So that's the issue that we are facing here. And so I can only really speak to so there's a number of discussions happening in Canada. One of them is to say, well, we do need housing for these desperate populations. Can we convert office buildings into housing? So there is talk about that on the assumption that there'll be less demand for offices after COVID. I think that they're partly right. I think the older offices, I think there will be less office space used, and I think the older offices are going to be vacant. However, conversion to housing is very difficult. Offices are very deep, then they don't have all the services in them for housing. So in Canada, there's this idea of maybe making social housing out of old offices, but I don't think that's going to work. And so the question we have is, if there are fewer people working downtown, and I do think that when we add up all the changes that we've seen, if people carry on working 2 days a week from home, and they used to be working 1 day a week from home, it's still 20% fewer people in downtown on any day, and that will be less space. But that space, what's going to be done with it? So that's the situation in Canada. I'm afraid I don't know enough about the Italian situation, and because for you, inner cities are places of poverty, as I understand it, whereas for us, the inner city is a place of business and of fairly well-off people living. So I think there's a very different urban geography that I'm dealing with here.
Okay, thank you, Richard. And I saw that Ugo Rossi, who is a professor from GSSI, wanted to make a question. Please, Ugo.
Yes, thanks for your lecture, which has been very interesting. I was thinking, what do you think if this kind of refashioning of work and labor in contemporary economies is kind of extending, generalizing what, in a way, Florida, in his book on the rise of the creative class, he, in a way, identified as the core element of what he defined the creative class, which was, as you noticed in a previous article, a knowledge aristocracy. The fact of flexibility, the fact of having the possibility to work a little bit from home, a little bit from the office, it is what Florida was describing. But the problem with this analysis was the fact that he was limiting this kind of model to a very specific elite that was that of advanced knowledge workers, while now it's become generalized. Even what he defined the service class or many people in the service class, like people working in the public administration and the like, can work in this way. So in a way is the fact that it proves that Florida's idea of the creative classes as such a limited portion of the workforce were wrong, because this kind of flexibility can be extended to a much wider workforce. This is basically my question. If in a way this has totally changed the way in which we look at knowledge, creativity, and work and labor in contemporary capitalist economies.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, in Florida's book, in The Creative Class, he did identify a set of workers who had different aspirations and different lifestyles. And one of them was that these people were more mobile, but for him, mobility was not mobility during the day. It was able to choose where to live, because of amenities. But you're right that he put his finger on a change of lifestyles that was occurring amongst a certain elite type of knowledge workers. And but he focused a lot on these people wanting to live in specific areas and on the importance of being in buzzing neighborhoods and be able to interact, and that these people were going to sort of go and live downtown or in places where they would meet other people like them in order to become creative. And so, yes, he was right that there was this new lifestyle. But where I think that I disagree, well, there's two things. One that he couldn't really have foreseen was that now what's interesting is that these very same people are the ones who are going to live in the suburbs or going to live in the countryside. They are not at all interested in being in bars anymore. They want to be away from everybody. So the spatial conclusions he draws from that, I think, need to be revised. The second issue I have with is the name. This idea that creativity is linked with this elite, I think, is totally wrong. I think that was a very pernicious idea, because it meant that cities reorganize their policies to attract people from an elite. Now, when you have urban policies for an elite, to me, that breeds inequality. So that was a problem with his work. But to be fair to Florida, this idea that they were changing lifestyles and that were partly linked to mobility and to knowledge work is, in fact, in a way reflected in what we've seen during COVID. It is these knowledge workers, but the best off knowledge workers, who in fact, what Florida was talking about, who have actually done best. They've done very well financially. They've kept their jobs. They've often in sectors which have done very well. They are often the people with the bigger houses who can work from home easily. They are the ones, if you see from New York, a lot of New Yorkers, well, not a lot, a small percentage, but of the creative class, if you will, went to the Hamptons and the sort of the countryside during COVID. So in a way, it is a creative class who has done very well out of COVID. I think his ideas on how spatial proximity is important for knowledge exchange really need to be rethought. We've seen that, and they need to be rethought before COVID, but we've seen that we can function at a distance. So clearly spatial proximity, it is important, but it's not crucial. So I think that the role played by neighborhoods in terms of what's called dynamic agglomeration economies, the interactions, really needs to be rethought, because there is face-to-face is important, but we don't need to be living together, and in fact, it's the work of Harold Bathelt and others on the importance of conferences and fairs, of people meeting from time to time, which I think is more closer to the mark in terms of how interactions lead to knowledge exchange than Florida's idea that we all need to be in a buzzing neighborhood. It's a bit of a meandering answer because there's many issues that you raise in your question. I'm sorry.
Yeah, sorry, it was a bit, regarding another little thing, spatial proximity, this is true, but at the same time, I can see all around investments, like, have you heard of Oslo Science City? That aspires to concentrate hundreds of new residents, knowledge-based economic workers in one place. And so it's the same in Europe with a lot of ecosystems of innovation being planned within the post-COVID recovery. And so there is a lot in public policy. It seems that policymakers still believe a lot in the advantages of spatial proximity.
I mean, the policymakers believe in it, but I think that I mean, first of all, a lot of these developments have a lot of real estate. So there's a lot of money involved in selling this idea. And it's also something that, I mean, politicians are usually in office for 4 or 5 years. It is better to point at this wonderful new science city, which tells all the stories that we want to hear, that we have all these wonderful, clever people creating knowledge and making the economy grow. It's a great story. I think empirically it doesn't hold up, but from a real estate perspective and a financial perspective, it does. And the other thing is that these people are not creative. They're people who earn a lot of money. And there's a big confusion, even in Florida. He identifies creative people as people who earn money. For him, if you earn a lot of money, it shows that you're creative. Now, for me, that's a total inversion. I mean, you know, this idea that somehow the amount of money you earn allows you to be identified as creative, which if you look at his creative class, that's how he identifies the occupations which are creative. He goes through and he says the higher income ones, they must be creative because they're earning money. So there's a tautological approach in his, which has fed through into public policy. So I actually, and public policy makers are themselves considered creative. If you look, you know, they're on the creative margins. They're not core creatives, but it's a very flattering story that he's telling, and everybody involved who is making decisions is part of the creative class. And who doesn't want to be creative? But I have great problems with the way that policymakers are still thinking that by cramming people into one space, there's going to be innovation and creativity. This just doesn't make sense. I mean, we can see it ourselves as academics. We collaborate with people who have similar ideas to us. And this is why travel is so important. You know, I get on well with my colleagues and I teach with them, but my research is being done with people in Austria. I've just done some work with Michaela Trippel, with Johannes Glückler in Heidelberg. You know, these are the people that I'm working with right now. And I think it's the same for all of us. I really don't believe that spatial proximity, and in fact, this actually comes out of my research. When you interview people, nobody is saying, oh, we are missing interactions with people outside our organization. Everybody is saying what's lacking is interactions within organizations. So I think that Florida's got the scale wrong. I think that spatial proximity is important within organizations. And why is it important? Because there's no barriers to knowledge exchange. If I share information with a colleague, the company's not going to lose money. We're not going to lose an idea. We're not going to lose a patent. But between companies have to protect their information. You cannot just have people out in science parks all sharing ideas. You know, it just doesn't work like that. You know, ideas are worth money, and so they are kept within organizations or within well-organized collaborations. It is just not true that you go to a bar and you talk about your latest bright idea. It's just not true in the private sector.
Unless you are drunk.
Unless you're drunk, exactly.
Okay, thank you, Richard.
Thank you.
Annalisa Spalazzi, she's our student, first year, and please, Annalisa.
Thank you for the lecture, really interesting, and also thank you for sharing the insights on how doing research has been changing over the time, because that's kind of very useful for us. My question is actually on the further development of this research, also based on the current debate in Italy on how this changing in spatial patterns for work will be structural, or whether it's just a response to emergency. And as the questionnaire and the survey was running immediately after, so there was the full time of needing to adapt to the emergency mode, I'm wondering whether there is the idea to repeat the research kind of 1 year after, so to see if this is a structural change in the work pattern for people moving, or whether it's already under discussion, and if it's similar the current debate in Montreal and in Canada.
Yeah, a very good question. We do have this debate. I haven't got any plans right now to run the survey again. In a way, I would like to run it when COVID is properly over, because right now it's not properly over. And so in a way, it's to run the survey maybe in 2 or 3 years would be interesting. Because right now, everybody's working at home again, since sort of the last week. So in a way, things are too changeable. And from all the other surveys I've seen, even though my results are from June and July 2020, it's basically been pretty similar over the last year, depending on the different waves of COVID. So it's a very good question. I'd like to see it when COVID is really over. However, I did with a student do a few, we did some interviews during some qualitative interviews during the summer of 2020. And then we did some follow-up interviews in February 2021. So these were the same people, but 8 months into COVID. And at that point, their work arrangements had not changed, but their attitude to the working from home had changed. Already in summer 2020, most people were saying they like working at home, but when we got talking, we identified some very clear problems of working at home, but still people were quite positive about it. By February 2021, the attitude was a lot more mixed. People were really, we'd identified it before, but these was just in remarks that people had not emphasized. In the follow-up interviews, they emphasized a lot more the problems in communication, the problems in just lack of social interaction. So I think that this seems to indicate to me that that when people can go back to the office, more people than we think will, but they probably aren't going to go back in the same way as before. And I think that this is where the question, is it structural or isn't it? That's a dichotomy. In fact, it's more complicated than a dichotomy. There were a lot of background changes happening. So even if there was no COVID, people would be working more from home in 2025 than they were in 2015. That was a long-term trend. And what I think is that COVID has accelerated the trend. When COVID finishes, we are going to go back, but not to how it was before COVID. We'll go back to where the long-term trend would have been. And that long-term trend, there was a lot of big corporations in the last 5 years before COVID were beginning to reorganize their workspaces. We're beginning to have flexible work. We're allowing people to work from home. That was happening before. So what I'm actually encouraging people to do to understand what's going to happen after COVID is to look very closely at what was happening between 2015 and 2020. Because a lot was happening there that we were still unaware of. And that's part of my story. As geographers, we were still happily measuring employment location at place of work up until 2020. There was very few people were questioning it. And now all of a sudden, we have discovered that people don't actually work at their normal place of work. But this was well known in management studies over the last 15 years, except that geographers haven't done anything about it. Urban planners have not done anything about it. So I think as geographers and planners, we really need to catch up with where our colleagues in organizational studies and management were, and then we'll understand better what post-COVID will be.
Thank you, Richard. So from the audience, are there any other questions? Please, Richard.
No, it's okay. No, I just was going to tell you your microphone was off.
Okay. Are there any other questions? No? Okay. So, Richard, I was really delighted to have you here. Thank you very much for your presence. Thank you very much for your speech and presentation and lecture. And I guess that our students really appreciated your words. And I underline again the fact that the importance of designing properly a survey, which is basically for for obtaining data. So I want to wish you a Merry Christmas. I want to wish a Merry Christmas to all our students. I cannot be with you at 4 o'clock because of personal stuff, but please have my best wishes. And Richard, I hope that one day we could, not because of code, because as I told you, our path crossed in somehow, but I really hope to know you in person. Thank you very much again.
Listen, thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you all for being here. I know it's a few days before Christmas. It's maybe not the most exciting way to spend an afternoon a few days before Christmas, but thanks a lot for being there. I'll just say, if you want to discover a bit more about the empirical side, it's all in the Urban Studies 2021 paper. So you do have access to that. But thank you very much. And I also wish you all Merry Christmas. And I'd really like to have a coffee with you, Fabiano, soon.
Okay. Thank you very much, Richard. See you soon. Ciao. Ciao.
Okay, goodbye.
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 Bye.
Hello, guys. Are you still there? Are you still there?